what's the most important lesson you've learned from a lifetime of writing?
Right.
Just write.
And I mean that. Because you have to keep doing it, and you learn with every new little bit that you do. Every book, every article teaches you something that you hadn't known before or hadn't known in this particular way. So it is a matter of constantly learning, constantly being alert, and taking from there.
Okay, you were a key figure in Die Zestigers. How successful do you feel that movement was in liberating Afrikaans literature and as a vehicle for political change?
I think, well, let's keep them apart in the beginning. I think it turned out to be extremely successful because of the dire situation in which Afrikaans fiction found itself right then. At that stage there had been a long tradition of very naturalistic, realistic kind of storytelling. Everybody did it more or less the same way. It was a 19th century sort of approaching the art of telling a story. So it was a pretty dreary thing in which poor whites and droughts dominated the whole scene in book after book, in story after story. And then as it happened, there was this group of young writers who had all spent shorter or longer period overseas, and especially in Paris. Paris became the sort of focal point and main point of reference for the whole movement, in as much as one can talk of a conscious movement. That bound us together. We wanted to do something new, and we wanted to do it in roughly comparable ways to the things that were happening overseas, and particularly in France at that time. There were some people like Jan Rabie or Barto Smit, who had spent something like 7 or 8 years abroad and really knew the scene out there extremely well. Others like Chris Barnard went for only 1 year or even slightly less, a number of months, but in that short space soaked up the atmosphere of what was happening, the newness of it. And because it was so startlingly different from anything that was happening in Afrikaans at that time, it immediately made an impression on our minds. And we just tried, like a sponge, to suck it all up. And so there was a sense of exhilaration, a sense of adventure, a sense of enjoyment in everything that we did. And we didn't get together very often. Right at the beginning, almost no one knew the others, or knew one or two of them, but certainly not. I don't think there was anybody among us who knew all of them. Not that makes it sound like a hell of a cluster of people, but there were only about 6 or 7 of us. So, and the country is big, so we didn't often get together. In fact, I think in the period that the Zestigers lasted, and that wasn't all that long, it was about 2 or 3 years, we got together as a group only 2 or 3 times. For the rest, of course, we corresponded, but correspondence in those days was nothing compared to what it is today. It's not a matter of just picking up a phone or writing an email, or it really meant to sit down and write a letter. And I think that's something completely different, but the art of writing letters is something that sadly has disappeared from the scene almost altogether. And all over the world, this change, this shift and this loss has made itself felt among writers very strongly. On the one hand, it slowed down everything very much, but it also meant that the communication was much more thorough than it now is. You can't just grab your cell phone or grab your, I mean, cell phones didn't exist. It sounds weird to think of a time before that. But these technological advances had a lot to do with the development of literature all over the world. And certainly in South Africa, with its spaces, its distances between people, and with the tremendous changes that were going on. So, in the society at the same time, it meant that when there were some people, as I said, we were about 5, 6, 7 perhaps, the communication was extremely intense among us, and there was this sense of discovery, of coming at a time when something drastically new was necessary in the field of writing. And we were there with this passion, this really fervent interest in the processes of writing. So all of this played a role, had an almost immediate effect on our work. And we did, at least some of us, did start from a very early stage when we started realizing that our interests lay in the same direction, to try and exchange our ideas. We were very fortunate in that one of our group, Dr. Smith, was a publisher. He was also a playwright. But he was a publisher, so he had access to publishing. And it meant that we could, from a very early stage, get and found a little magazine which brought us together, which fired our interest, and which gave us a possibility of going to the public, of bringing what we were doing to the attention of lots of other people out there. Now, this magazine only lasted for 2 years, partly because right in the beginning we decided that even though we were passionately fired by the same interest in prose writing, in storytelling, we did not want to be a school. We didn't want to be too close. We wanted no sort of sense of inbreeding and everybody in the little group really doing the same sort of thing. I think that in the end was one of the weaknesses of the group, that we did not last long enough. It was only these 2 years because of the deliberate decision that we'd taken beforehand. And so we were brought together, and at the same time we were kept apart, because we were aware from the very beginning that even in our sense of storytelling, we approached it from so many different angles. Each one of us had a really different way of wanting to tell a story. And it so happened that almost inevitably, our interest in a new kind of writing coincided with a need in our society, which in world terms, of course, is very small, was also interested in pretty radical new ideas. And because, as I said, all of us, in one way or another, and for shorter and longer periods, had spent time abroad, we brought those ideas back with us, and we wanted to go on exploring and exploiting. So, because of this convergence of ideas, the press at large in South Africa became very interested in what this movement was about, and what we were trying to do. The Afrikaans press, but also the English. And that gave us a larger window on the world, through which they could look into us and we could look after them. And this became an immensely fruitful part of the whole communication setup within which the Sessachers operate.
Having the first Afrikaans book banned by the South African government change your direction as a writer?
It certainly made a change, and a very radical one. Because censorship had been in the air, had been sort of born with the movement. that was just the time when the government was thinking in terms of passing a new censorship act, systematizing the whole approach to literature, English and Afrikaans. But because it was largely an Afrikaans government, the nationalist government, the apartheid government, their primary focus was deviant writers in their own midst who were threatening to challenge the long-held opinions and approaches of the Afrikaner community. And that meant that the interaction with the press, the interest of the press, was such that almost nothing that we did could pass unnoticed. And in a way it was wonderfully fruitful. It was very stimulating to know that we were not operating somewhere apart from where things were happening. Everything was part of this community, and there were a few journalists. Ellen Zille was one of them. From a very early stage, she was working at the Grand Daily Mail at the time. And so she brought an English, wider perspective, representing a wider political view. And then there was a terrible, scruffy shit of a man called Maish Levine, who worked for the Sunday Times. And he became absolutely fascinated by what we were doing. And he was a very, very bad journalist. He was one who quite regularly would, after a long interview of an hour or several hours, would say, "Oh my God, I forgot to press the right button," or whatever, so he didn't record a single bloody but then he said, don't mind, I'll fill it in afterwards, which he did in his own way, inventing most of what you heard.
Misquoting you completely.
Total. But that was just his way of writing. I remember there was this moment I was with the publisher, Chris Human, who was one of the two key publishers of the Sisterhood group. And I was living in Grahamstown at the time, but I'd come to Cape Town very often, because that was the time of my relationship with Ingrid Jonker, and for that reason I hadn't wanted to come to Cape Town very often. And one day I was going with Chris, and there was a bar very close to the office of Human Interest in Kiron Street. And we went there for coffee, and Maish was there, as he was always there. And he started talking to us. Maybe because he didn't know me at the time. Although when he decided that somebody might be interesting from any point of view that interested him, he just wouldn't let go. It was like an octopus. And like a vampire, it would suck you dry. And he wouldn't stop before he got what he wanted. And what he wanted was not always anything that really had a vague connection to the truth. Anything that sort of made him sit up. He was physically dirty. He stank. He was, but so he was awful. But at the same time, he was, because he was at the Sunday Times, which was by far the biggest newspaper in the country, with strong connections to overseas as well. It meant that when you landed there, it was to your detriment because everything came out wrong at the other end. But at the same time, it gave publicity, and publicity was immensely important for a movement which was so unknown and so new in the beginning. And then on this morning, we spoke to Maish, and Chris said to him, "I don't want to talk to you." I said, "Oh, no, I'm not be silly." we're friends, we're just chatting, there's not an interview or anything. And Chris said, but I know you. You're going to twist everything that I say around and it'll come out differently the other end. He said, no, but I will never do that. I have my own integrity to protect. Spun us a long spiel on that. And Chris said, I don't like you. I don't want to talk to you. And I said, but why don't you like me? And he said, well, I can give you a few reasons. First of all, you stink. And I don't like bad-smelling people. Chris was very forthright. And he said, you are unreliable because you never listen properly and you twist and distort everything. And then thirdly, you are a nuisance because you usually interrupt when one is talking to somebody else and involved in doing something else. Andre has come down to Cape Town for a specific reason to discuss a new book with me. Oh yes, but I'm very interested in that. No, fuck you, it's none of your business. He's here to discuss private business with me. So he has nothing to say to you. Ah, don't worry, said Masha. I will find something that interests you. I said, I know you'll find something that interests you, which has nothing to do with what interests me or us. So just fuck off. And then Masha said, oh, he was such a miserable creature that one always felt a huge pity for him. The poor bastard. You just wanted to help him in some way, knowing that you're digging your own grave in the process. And then he went on and enumerated all these things, starting with the smelling, starting with the fact that he was totally unreliable, that he lied, that you couldn't tell him anything, and know that he would keep you either to himself or at least stick to the truth about what you were trying to say. That he was dirty, he was, in every sense of the word, an unreliable and an objectionable person. And then after about 3/4 of an hour of this, he said to Chris, yeah, but apart from that, why don't you like me? So, that was Mash. And of course, it was a terrible interview. It wasn't a terrible interaction. And what came out of that was just unbelievable. But I suppose because the stories were so invented, they were so totally unfounded in every possible respect. In a way, he also attracted people to him who wanted to talk to him because they didn't know what on earth he would write about. It was fun, it was exciting. And anyway, that was him, and he stayed with the movement throughout a few years, and for years after, he would keep on phoning us and contacting us, so that the dissemination of whatever was happening in the 60 circle in the wider world kept on being known and discussed and disseminated. So he fulfilled a certain function, not necessarily a very useful one, but from the point of view of keeping the group in view of readers throughout the country and in some other spots like London and very soon even New York via the Sunday Times. So that even Time and Newsweek started writing articles about what we were doing, which was quite a thrill for us who had never thought of a larger audience at all, and suddenly part of the attention of the world was focused on us. I mean, there was so bloody little to write about that, as far as South Africa was concerned. I mean, a part that one could write about, of course, and they did. There are newspapers all over the world. But at the same time, it was just the same old story all the time. But Mesh made sure that there were new little juicy tidbits here and there which he could feed to the press. For instance, Ingrid Jonker and her father was one of the leading nationalist members of Parliament, and there were strong rumors that he would be in charge of the new censorship board once that would be instituted. And of course, Ingrid was one of the seminal figures within the Zestige movement, and she had links to all of us. So, of course, she was of great interest to mention, and she was the most unconventional sort of person who could take a view, a totally different, unexpected, staggering, shocking, scandalous view of young South Africans to the world at large, and measured his bit there too, willy-nilly. And so in these ways, what we did and what initially was meant to be kept among us, this little group, became spread all over the world. So he fulfilled his function, and it certainly wasn't a positive one all the way, but it had its positive aspects in keeping the world informed about something new, something different that was being hatched in this country, smothering itself in apartheid at the time.
Okay.
May I ask something quickly? Are you still in contact with any of these people?
Yes, just a few of them.
Okay.
But in fact, I don't have very much contact with the world at large at the moment.
Okay.
But somebody like Chris Barnard and like Abraham de Vries are still among my best friends. But, I mean, Butler Smith is dead.
Okay.
Jan Ravi is dead. Marjorie Wallace, who was a painter but was married to Jan and was very much bobbleback, and a wonderful person. So she was much sought after by the press elsewhere, and she'd lived in Paris for about 10 years or so. So she had a lot of stories to tell and was interested in many things happening in the world. And Eric Loebscher, the other day, painter first of all, but very close to the group. So these things got disseminated, and because some of us were very intense friends, and that then of course got dished up to the eyes of the world every Sunday, information, disinformation, and then we inevitably kept in contact. There are some of the members of the Zestige group, as much as one can even talk of a group, because as a group we were not very touched. It was mainly through the magazine that our views kept on being fed to a larger world. But because of that, some of us at least kept in contact very, very closely, and still do. The few of us that are left, but there are only about 3 of us at the moment. So we are really a dwindling group.
Do you think they'd be willing to allow us to interview them as well, if they are local?
I think they would.
That would be great.
Bram de Vries certainly is in Cape Town. He's about the only other one. Chris Barnard, but he now lives in Mpumalanga, and unfortunately, the farm on which he lived was attacked last year, twice in fact. He was very badly injured, so that made him even more reluctant. He was always somebody very private, and that made him less eager to speak to the press.
Understandably.
That is about that.
Was that actually a personal attack, or was it just...
Yes.
Okay.
I've heard that Dean said that you touch a nerve on Afrikaans people. Do you think this is true, and if so, why do you think it's true? Why do you think you do that?
That I am in touch with them or not in touch?
No, you touch a nerve.
Oh, well, it was just because at that particular time, with apartheid reaching a crucial stage in its development, when there were some people starting to ask questions Bayer's no dear was breaking away from the party. Somebody like Brink became enormously influential because his father was a minister of education, young Klerk. And he was very outspoken, and from a very early stage he had a regular column in what was then the predecessor of the Port, so that could be disseminated pretty widely. And he coined the term verlig and verkrampt for the more enlightened and the more dried up and cramped and shriveled group within the National Party was largely responsible for formulating policy. So what we thought and what we were interested in could still continue to be disseminated in a very large group. The report was very, very influential, not always a good paper. There were times when it was really good. Now it is in one of its moments of decline, I think, as the press generally is right now. Of course, it's not an easy time for printed press. And everybody is moving online and finding other forms of expression. But in those days, at least we were fortunate in having the interest of the written press and to unscrupulous characters like Mighty and some others. What we wrote and spoke about and said did become, as I said several times already, disseminated in a much larger context.
Okay. What is the biggest obstacle you had to overcome in your career?
Well, I think censorship was something that always loomed very large. And it was, and it soon became very much a reality, not just a bogeyman somewhere in the background. When my Kennis van the Ark was banned, and it was a wonderful day for the press, because they had something really juicy to report on and to hang on to, and well, it made an interesting story all over the world. Even in countries like Guatemala or Vietnam and so on, which for many other reasons were interested in South Africa or interested to South Africa. They wrote about the Zestigers, and that wasn't an important breakthrough for us in preparing also a market of readers out there. So by the time we started publishing in languages, well, in English, it meant that there were people out there ready to start sending our work to friends of theirs and to bring us to the attention of a larger group. So that made a hell of a difference to our preoccupations and to my preoccupations as a writer. I think my interest became much more international.
It almost helped your career. It almost helped your career to a degree.
Oh, it certainly did. And after I started publishing and my work started getting translated into 20, 30 different languages, inevitably it made a difference in what I wrote and in what I was interested in writing. So it was a kind of vehicle that once it started moving, I couldn't want to stop.
Of course.
Of all of your achievements, what makes you the most proud?
It is such a moving scene, and writing is such an active, constantly changing and developing form of communicating, And in a world that is changing so fast, but it is difficult to keep track of everything. Because something which might have been immensely important to me at a particular stage, for particular reasons, as a result of a particular book, as the ban on chemistry and the aunt, for instance, wrote about, or the consequent translation of the book in a variety of other languages. That changed what I was doing, and that changed my perception of what I had done. Things that at the moment would seem tremendously important to me. After a year or two, or even sometimes after a few months, it will no longer be so important. I am by nature curious. I want to find out the why, the wherefore, the how. And so that kept me moving, and that created a sort of shifting environment, which made it impossible to pin down anything specific, which for a reasonable time was for me the most important at the time of interest.
Yes. Okay. Your latest book, Lydia, it was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. How do you feel about missing out on that for the third time?
Well, there were so many other times in between that it just became part of what was happening. But for me, always there has been a sense of achievement and disappointment in every book. It was nice to get the book done. It was nice to see it printed. It was nice to see it moved to other languages. But at the same time, there was a sense of disappointment with every book, all the time. But I always knew this isn't quite what I wanted to do. I wanted to be better. I wanted to be different. I wanted to try something new. So there was a sense of disappointment every time, and it becomes part of the package. You sort of work knowing that you're never going to get where you really want to be. So you just keep on, and that keeps it exciting. It keeps it adventurous. It keeps a sense of adventure alive in what one does all the time.
Protagonist's voice in the novel sounds very authentic, yet her situation couldn't be more different from yours. How did you get inside of the mind of a black female slave?
I think writing, whatever the product is, has as a basic premise, and that is to imagine yourself into the skin of somebody else. So it is something, without that thing you can't even start by. Even if I want to write about a trip to town to do some shopping, or meeting somebody in the mall, or whatever, a certain amount of displacement takes place, and you come across the opinions, the views of other people around you. And sometimes they are violently different, sometimes they are very close together, but then there are shades and nuances of difference between them anyway. And in order to try to understand the world in which you live, this need to move out of yourself and into the imagination and the living world and the history and the story of other people, it just can't function. So that is where I think writing, storytelling stops. And if that leads you very far from where you set out from, as in this case, the mind of a slave woman in the 18th century, then it is just part of the process that happens all the time anyway.
So you're saying it's just the nature of the job?
Yes, okay. Absolutely.
What are you working on at the moment?
It's a new novel, which is not quite halfway into it, but something I discovered in the process of writing for Lida, which came from the history of my family, my predecessors, my ancestors. And I found another person that is at the moment the passion of my life. She grew up as a little girl in the Karoo, literally barefoot. Her father became very interested in politics. They lived in, as I said, in the Karoo, and that was up there, not very close to Cape Town at all. But through her father's connections in the political world of the end of the 19th century, or even earlier in the 19th century, she got in touch with some of the bigger names of her world, of the politicians, people like from the diamond world, Barney Bernardo and Cecil Rhodes, and that meant also the political world around the Cape. And she, at quite an early age, was taken by an Afrikaner family with connections in England, with them to England, not for a long time, a year or two. That happened first at the time when she was only about 9. But then later, after she'd come back, her father died, and she was forced to come back. But then some of the bigger names, even the governor of the Cape Colony and his wife became interested in her, and when they had to go to London, he was a sort of early forerunner of the ambassadors and the high commissioners of the country abroad in London. And they'd taken a fancy to this young girl and took her with them. And so she landed in London in the theatre world, met one of the key figures there, Oscar Wilde, who was, from many points of view, an utterly remarkable person in his time, the late 19th century. She even became the mistress of the Prince of Wales. It was rumored that she had a child by him, and that so I would have royalty in my family. And just from any possible point of view, she became a totally remarkable young person. And after there, she met one of the landlords, John, the double-barreled name, Lace somebody, but it doesn't matter which one it was. But he was a very important figure in the South African business world then. And he married her. She was married to 2 people at the same time, but it was just the beginning of an immensely colorful life. Came back with him, settled at the Rand, had a house designed by Sir Herbert Baker, one of the great grand houses of Johannesburg, which still exists and is now a museum. And they have concerts and things there, so it is still very much alive. And met everybody who was anybody. And she used to drive around when they came back and lived in Johannesburg in that splendid house. She would drive around in a coach drawn by 6 zebras. Wow. And she was just way out in every imaginable sense. And she had a bath that moved on rails from the bathroom to the bedroom, and then occasionally somebody might press the wrong button and she would be drawn in all her splendid nakedness, because she was very beautiful, into the lounge when there were people gathering for a concert or something. And she seemed to take it all in her stride, in fact, to take a sort of perverse delight in that sort of thing. So she was a most amazing person. And then their fortune disappeared, which was in those circles something only to be expected. And she ended up in a 2-roomed little zinc house in one of the poor suburbs of Johannesburg and died in rather miserable circumstances, having experienced everything that her time could offer, from being the mistress of the Prince of Wales to that. So it is a fascinating life, and it is a life that, to the dirty mind of a reader, of a writer, just is so fascinating that I could not let it learn.
Sounds great. Okay. You were a lecturer at Rhodes and at UCT. What do you have to say about the university system?
It isn't what it used to be. I think, thank God that when I retired, it was just about at the time when universities started changing from educational institutions to big corporations. So now they have to be well run. The finances have to determine everything that happens, and it's just not my side, my scene at all anymore. I think there are a few excellent universities in the country. BITS is one, UCT is another, not many more. That can really compare with what America and Britain and a few other countries may be offering. But for the rest, I think our education is in a terrible situation right now. And we are the sort of foster parents, not officially, but just. Our housekeeper's daughter, who is very bright and is just now finishing school, she will be going to Rhodes next year. So through her, it is possible to stay in touch with much of what is still happening in the country. And because she's black, she and very bright. She sees what is happening and certainly doesn't like it all, and is impressed by some and totally unimpressed by other aspects of it. And in that way, inevitably, one just sort of keeps in touch with the country.
Do you think that writing can be taught, or do you think it's something that's innate?
I have taught in creative writing for many years, here and in America, and a bit in France. Never for long periods, because precisely of this child who is no longer a child, and we never wanted to leave her alone here for too long. So on short trips she would accompany us, or otherwise we would just make sure that we kept them short. But sorry, this time I really lost track of the question.
Do you think the writing can be taught, or do you think it's something that's innate?
You can't teach somebody to write. If it isn't there, if the talent isn't there, and the curiosity, and the ability to write, to be fascinated by language, then it can't be taught from the outside. But there has to be something, there has to be a certain interest, a certain curiosity, and a certain ability. Then one can certainly refine it, and you can send it in particular directions or open up possibilities and options. And in that respect, I think courses in writing can be very useful. But to teach somebody to write is just not right.
What is your creative process?
Because of my teaching of it, inevitably I am interested not just in writing, but in asking questions about it, to find out how and why a certain thing is written in a certain way. And in that sense, I remain curious about the topic, but the writing, and this is really repeating in a different way what I have already said, is just not something that you But you can't teach somebody to paint. You can teach somebody some of the techniques, some of the possibilities. You can show prospective students some of the world of painting, just as I can show students of writing, or get them to read and read and read and read as much and as diversely as possible, so they can see what has been done, what are some of the ways in which things can be done, and then they can try to choose a certain direction which suits them, which suits their specific talent or interest, and you can take it from there, but not much more.
But your personal creative process when it comes to you writing a book?
That has changed over the years. Now that I'm growing older, it is much more laborious. It takes me about 5 times the time that it used to take to write a book before. And I used to try to write very fast so that I could grapple with the ideas very intensely for a short time and then sit down again with it and start sorting it out and start following some of the paths that I've taken and abandoned. Now all of that happens much more slowly. So it takes me a couple of years to do a book, whereas previously I occasionally did a book in a few weeks, but say several months at least.
Wow.
And then for the time that I write, but see that also had to change. Because when I was writing, immersed in a book, I would be so totally lost to the world that I could focus only on that writing. And it meant that for 10, 12, 15, sometimes 20 hours a day while I was writing, I would just be there and not do anything else. And then would be totally exhausted until I started the revising process, which I really think is the most important part of the job of writing. But now all of that happens much more slowly, and much more slowly. But in a way, I try to comfort myself by thinking that it is also now, I have the opportunity of doing it more thoroughly. And I am extremely fortunate in having a truly, in every respect, truly remarkable wife, who is a writer herself, and so understands the highways and byways of writing. And in Felida, for instance, because that was the first book that really took me several years to write. And I'd lost track of all the aspects of the story of Felida. And Karina could help me to sort out the incredible mess of the manuscript. Because I would write some things, some events, 3 or 4 or 5 times in different ways. And so we had to sort them out. Now she's drawing up big charts and putting them up on blackboards and so on for me to be able to follow my own story and then make choices as I go along and see, but as I've already said, this I've used in a way that is more successful there, and so on. But it becomes a very complicated sort of jigsaw puzzle building, which in itself I find fascinating. So the process has always fascinated me, but because of the change in speed, some changes have entered the whole process itself. So I can't say that, I do my writing in the night. I've never been a night owl, and I can't write early in the morning. Early is sort of before lunch.
Okay.
So sometime after that.
Okay.
Once you've eaten and settled.
That's right, yeah. And inevitably, once I've spent some time in the bath, I do a hell of a lot of my writing in the bath.
That's good.
It is I think the relaxation, perhaps the return to the anti-nuptial world.
With some bubbles and a little rubber ducky floating around.
Not the bubbles, yes. Not with the ducky. So, yeah, there's not a specific little routine that I follow.
Okay. What about research? How do you get into the minds of the characters that you're writing about? Do you go
I
on
think that
side?
is, of course, it is something that was sort of built into me from the beginning. That is why I started writing. I am fascinated by people, by their ways of doing things, and by how their minds work. And it is amazing how much one just finds out by observing, starting with your friends, your family, your people moving close to your family, watching very avidly and curiously and inquisitively, asking questions. And from there it just escalates all the time.
Okay. How do you deal with writer's block?
If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said, I have no idea of what it is. But now I know. But I try, perhaps I'm still naively in the beginning stages of that, to believe that if I just try hard enough, sooner or later something gives way and I can break through.
Okay. What advice do you have for young writers?
Right, again, where we started.
Okay.
Now, read as much as possible. I think that there is no exercise as good and as profitable for a writer as reading.
Okay.
As varied as you can, to see how other people did it. Try reading the greats. Try to find out what made them succeed or not succeed. Sometimes you can learn more from other people's failures than from their successes. Try to find out why a certain book works and another book doesn't work. And then try either to follow or steer away from that.
Okay. You've been married 5 times, apparently. 4 times. And that's what my research told me.
Yeah, I know there was one particular interview that I had with The Guardian and said 5, and for some reason that became the one that was sent into the world, because it sounds more interesting.
Okay, what observations have you made about women? Having been married 4 times, what have you picked up on and how has that informed your writing?
Well, I think I was just, for most of my life, I can't say unlucky, in that I had to move through so many relationships before I found one really, 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 really good one. And now I can say I know what a good marriage is about. In another sense, I was possibly not lucky. And there, as in writing itself, as I said, it is through your failures rather than your successes that you can evaluate the situation. But I am fascinated by women as people. But I'm fascinated by people, whether they are male or female. And as I say, at the moment I'm writing about Oscar Wilde, and that means that gayness is something that fascinates me too. Not that I could ever move in that direction. But the way in which people live, the way in which people assess themselves as people, the way in which people demarcate the road they follow, the path they follow, the things they get interested in. That has always fascinated me, even as a child, and that just goes on.
Okay. Some authors say that they can't choose a favorite book. It's like choosing a favorite child. Can you? And if so,
not really.
You can't. Okay.
And so, if I reply to that question, it would always be different. If you ask it to me tomorrow, it would be different from the answer I give you today.
Who are your literary idols or influences?
The great Spanish writer Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote. that to me remains the greatest book ever written. Shakespeare, one of the funniest, one of the liveliest, one of the saddest writers who ever lived. And one can just reread and reread and reread, even though he was not a novelist, he was a dramatist, but writing, of course, the genre in which you write will always decide choices that you make and the things that you prefer. But I don't think anybody could do better than to read and reread and reread and reread Shakespeare. And something like Women, I don't think anybody has written more perceptively about women than the man Shakespeare.
Okay, the character of Eugene Moritz in the Ingrid Johnson movie Black Butterflies is widely believed to be based on you. How do you feel about that perception?
Wrong, like most perceptions. There are certain approximations, but frankly, I think it was a very bad film in terms of the way in which different people were portrayed. I don't think it's even scratched the surface of some very fascinating human relationships. And I was obviously too personally involved to ever stand back far enough and evaluate it. So my view of it will have to be prejudiced and skewed.
Okay. You're intensely opposed to the secrecy bill. What, in your opinion, can writers do to fight back?
I think just go on doing what we have been doing, protesting as loudly and as variously as possible, pointing out the stupidities of what the government is doing and has been doing for long. Because just returns to the sort of stupidities that the Nats committed throughout the whole of the apartheid period. But I suppose it's not even limited to what the Nats did or what Zuma and his group are doing. It is something that goes with power. And once the corruption of power seeps into a society, I'm afraid that it is just one way in which it can end. Thank God it does end. That is the one thing one does learn through a reasonably long life. That none of this ever lasts.
True.
But also, people just never learn. They just go back, committing the same mistakes in the same way. We are basically, I think, a favorite species. It's not a species to be proud of. I think the cockroaches are much more intelligent, making sure that you stay alive.
Great, that's my last question. That's all. That was good. Thank you.
May I ask something? You seem, from what I picked up, to have a certain amount of disdain towards the movement towards online writing and online reporting. Is there something sort of personal there with you that you just don't like the style of it, or do you feel that people are actually...
No, it's just I think that I've been left behind.
Okay.
To be quite frank, I just didn't keep up sufficiently with technology and the developments there.
Do you have any personal blogs or write for any sort of online things? Nothing?
No. No, I stay out of that altogether.
So you wouldn't be interested in writing like an article or two for our House of Publishers site?
I'm afraid not.
Okay.
No, I'm fortunate in that Karina is much more interested and much more with it as far as these things go. And that gives me a sort of glimpse from afar, but I don't need more than the glimpse.
Okay.
So you like to really know what you're getting yourself into before you like to really understand what you're getting involved in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
Cool.
all right.
That was great.